It's a total control system. It's a total regulatory system that would span multiple nation states. So in other words, this effectively gets rid of the federalist system that we have here in the United States with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, especially Amendment 10, which grants all powers not explicitly granted in the Constitution to the states or the people. As long as we have a Constitution still in effect, which parts of it still are, we can fight back. If we choose to do nothing, then our Constitution's not going to matter. It's going to matter less and less every day.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for April 13th through April 20th, 2026, while supplies last. First this week, 1 ounce gold Austrian Philharmonics are just $99 over spot. Next, 1 ounce silver UK Britannia are $6.25 over spot. And finally, kilo Silver Valcambi bars are just $5.35 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah K. Johnson with Liberty and Finance. And back with us today is our good friend Robert Kientz from the Freedom Report. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely happy to be.
We just had you on last week, but you mentioned how the Senate had passed a bill that included a clause on essentially banning retail central bank digital currency use until 2030. And it's interesting how, why did they put that, that end of the ban in there? Why did they say only until 2030? I'd like to get your perspective on that and kind of, is that sort of a timeline in your perspective on when central bank digital currency is going to be rolled out, or why do you think they put that specific date in there?
It's interesting because 2030 seems to be key and pivotal to a lot of international agreements like Agenda 2030 in the UN, which we can get into, where the UN has explored the use of CBDCs and digital currencies and digital payment systems to support those goals of Agenda 2030. So, they go hand in hand. Essentially, what you have to have is you have an agenda to do certain things. You have to have a system to enforce that agenda. So if we go back to the CBDCs for a minute, Trump signed an executive order that prohibits federal agencies from adopting the use of a CBDC, but it's an executive order. All it is the president saying, my administration won't do that right now. That can be reversed at any time. It can be reversed by him or any other president. So that the executive order really is just sort of a stay. And I believe the reason they did the stay on the CBDCs was when you look at what was being implemented for CBDCs and you look at the BIS documentation of that, the CBDC model is going to be used more by the East and the BRICS nations, whereas the U.S. wants to go more the stablecoin route. So they want to do stablecoins based on like U.S. treasuries, whatever U.S. debt's going to be or whatever U.S. assets are going to be. And they're really working through that those stablecoins, promoting those stablecoins. For example, we've seen Trump's son, Trump himself, Scott Bessent, all of these people from the administration and related to the administration saying that they want to take the U.S. economy 100% digital, meaning all financial assets. And they're already doing this. If you look at Hyperliquid, I think this trades maybe on Robinhood's platform. I forget where. I believe it's Robinhood's, or maybe this is on other platforms. But Hyperliquid allows you to put all assets on a single blockchain. So think about your bank account with digital currencies, with your mortgage, with your car loan, with your stock investments, all sitting on a single account, single blockchain. Okay, that would seem awesome from just a user perspective because you could manage all of those together. And if it's on the same blockchain, you may actually be able to, like, it may be easier to get a home equity line of credit, or it may be easier to convert those stocks directly into, Bitcoin if that's what you want to do. I mean, there could be some pauses from the standpoint of managing your assets. And that's probably how that's going to be sold as. But the flip side of that, if it's all on the same chain and someone is regulating that chain, which they would have to be, this is a government initiative to do this, it's probably going to be done through the Fed and the Treasury, along with help from several other government departmental offices. That those rules and regulations would manage everything together. And It's really an extension of what happened in the 90s. So a little bit of history here. In the 90s, they took money market funds and said, we're going to create sweep accounts, and we're going to sweep your money in a money market fund to this sweep account. We're going to put it in the fine print of your bank agreement so you don't really pay attention to it. And so at the top level at your account, you're seeing this money in a money market, but they fractional reserve it basically 90-1, not 9-1, 90-1. And they put that money out at riskier investments. And in addition to that, you don't really own your money market or your bank account or your stock account. Those laws were changed in the late 90s through the aughts, through 2010. And then if you add Dodd-Frank on top of that with bail-in law, essentially what they've created is, if you have a financial account, and this is 90% of financial accounts today, you don't own the asset, you're a beneficial owner. And there are laws in place which allow the government to take those assets if they need to for other things, as long as they give you some sort of equal value in return. And usually that's going to be a paper IOU or a paper promise. Look at the dollar. What's holding up the dollar? It's the good faith of the U.S. government. So how do people feel? And we know how people that watch this channel feel about the U.S. dollar and the good faith of the U.S. government being able to support that. We think the currency is going to collapse, and that's why a lot of us are gold, silver people, or at least we're looking at other financial ways of protecting ourselves financially. But this system is more of a dragnet, where if you get those CBDCs in place and you get things like hyperliquid and combining everything on chain, then it gives an immense amount of control to centralized agencies who are going to regulate those. And it gives immense control to whatever outlet you're putting your assets on. Right now, I may have a mortgage with this company, and I may have an auto loan with this company, and I may have my stocks with this company, and I may own my gold and silver somewhere else. You know, you've got different companies and intermediaries all working under different frameworks. If you put that all into one framework with the existing laws, it basically allows the government to control your assets. Now, if we go back to the executive order, Trump banning CBDCs, they want to do stablecoins. And so I think this law that we talked about last week, where the Senate has approved, it's not signed into law yet, but the Senate has approved no CBDCs to 2030. It's actually a little misleading. No retail CBDCs until 2030. They didn't prevent wholesale. So if you understand how central bank digital currencies work, there are two layers as developed by the BIS system and all those participants. There were 119 countries participating in this, by the way. That's all of the major countries, and most of the countries of any size around the world have been involved in. I think 74 projects at latest reporting are either in the final stages of completion or are complete. And if you look at that system, there's a wholesale CBDC, which is for country-to-country things like trading goods and services, to where the largest banks and the treasuries and central banks of the land can use that wholesale CBDC to remit payments across. The people would get a retail CBDC, which would be like a digital dollar, essentially, that we use on our apps or whatever the case may be, that we have to transact in, and then our bank accounts are denominated in. And if you look at the way they did that architecture, the retail CBDCs, they could blow that up through inflation and bad policy. And once it blows up, they just reissue a new one, and it doesn't affect the wholesale CBDC. So part of the reason they put that system in place is they don't want any more sovereign defaults. And this is where the world is actually working together. The world doesn't want sovereign defaults. The world wants a wholesale CBDC or stablecoin system to which they can enact trade that does not blow up. They want to allow the failures to be contained within their own jurisdictions. Now, and by having this layer at the top, which is not banned by this legislation in the U.S. and hasn't been explicitly banned by Trump either, having this layer at the top, which allows countries and large banks and countries to transact to one another, would allow them then to have the framework for implementing all of these other things that they want to implement. So let's talk about some of the other things they want to implement. The World Health Organization has agreement from over 100 countries to promote, educate, to make recommendations on healthcare, vaccines, all sorts of health to the world under a standard unified format determined by bureaucrats in the the World Health Organization. So technocrats running healthcare for the entire world. And like I said, the United States has signed on to this. Over 100 countries have signed on to this. And this program basically says they can intervene. If there's some sort of outbreak or they have a concern in a specific county in the U.S., or a specific parish in the UK, or a specific area in Africa, they can intervene the way that they want to. They can force Intervene means forced medical procedures for the good of society. Let's look at what happened at the pandemic where, they closed down the economies around the world for this unproven vaccine. And now we're just getting reports out where Pfizer VP who ran that project came out and said, and this is in congressional testimony, this is public record, came out and said they stopped the animal testing of their COVID-19 vaccine because they were killing all the animals. And he's come out and said they knew internally, Pfizer knew that essentially the vaccine killed more people than the COVID virus did, and they released it anyway. And all the pharmaceutical companies are protected against, so the medical interventions, it doesn't have to have good science behind it. If the technocrats want to implement this, they can. So that's the health side of it. And then if you look at the rest of Agenda 2030 at the UN, they're talking about things like social inclusion. They're talking about ending hunger 100%. They're talking about controlling mineral resources. So if you look at what they're saying behind the scenes, read between the lines, it's a total control system. It's a total regulatory system that would span multiple nation states. So in other words, this effectively gets rid of the federalist system that we have here in the United States with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, especially Amendment 10, which grants all powers not explicitly granted in the Constitution to the states or the people. This would subvert that, and it would basically be a layer around it that the United States, through their treaty power and contract power, can agree to, but it's unconstitutional. But I don't see anybody fighting it at the constitutional level. But it would allow basically complete control over just about everything you wanted to do, or they could turn off your currency with these digital currencies because they're going to control them and regulate them. And their stated goal, if it's to end hunger, that means if you're not on board with whatever they're doing to end hunger, they can control you through this system. If they've got all of your assets on a single chain, if they've got the Dodd-Frank bail-in laws, if they've got this agreed to World Health Organization proposal and treaty and constitution that they rolled out, and they also have all these other 2030 goals around climate change, around equality, inclusion. We've seen what inclusion means. It usually means excluding white Christians. So inclusion is everybody else, right? It's not a system that edifies the current American standard of government and is potentially a very dangerous system. And for those people that think that they won't smash all these things together, I would just encourage you to go look at history and name me any regime across the world that has ever passed such measures and not used it to oppress the people within, their nation state, going back to, thousands of years of history. So the ban on CBDCs till 2030 is really just creating runway. That tells me that's probably when they expect the dollar's really going to go kaput. They probably have some agreements with other nation states to not totally de-dollarize and destroy it till 2030 so they can get these plans implemented. Because remember, the whole world wants to go on digital currency. The whole world is agreeing to the WHO mandates on health. The whole world is agreeing to the UN mandates under 2030. And so if the whole world is doing this, the whole world wants us to transition into this digital system. And, the digital currency controls and the laws that the UN promulgates around how society should act are going to end up being like a global sort of government, if you will. And it doesn't mean that the enforcement in every area is going to be the same. It doesn't mean, that it's going to be 100% technocratic society, but it's moving in that direction. And I believe you put all these things together, it's moving in that direction. And that's why the 2030 significance, because all of the things that they want to do with the social goals and the far left policy they want to implement across the world, even Marxist policy, because it traces back to the Communist Manifesto and Marxism and all that. They're implementing that plan now, and they're going to do it with this digital control system. And if you don't like it, I don't know how you're going to get out of it, honestly. Right now, we have time to fight it. I don't know going forward if we don't fight it at the legislative level now and we don't educate people on it, I don't know if they're going to have any recourse, other than going and living out in the woods, and just try. You're going to have to take yourself out of society, and you're going to have to be able to bushcraft and make your own things and survive, just like we did in the olden days when we were moving west. So what we did in the United States, we learned how to survive. Well, we may be going back to that period, because if the government gets control of all of this stuff, you tell me any bureaucrat is not going to use that to promote whatever their ideology is. I've never seen a human on this planet, whether a king, a president, or otherwise, who wasn't given this level of power, who didn't abuse it or anything close to it. And we know what history says about people and these types of tyrannical type of controls or tools that could be used for tyrannical purposes. And that's really my concern. And once they came out with that bill saying no CBDCs till 2030, I thought, okay, you're not banning wholesale. So you can still be working on your country to country CBDC. And then I think what they're going to do in terms of the retail CBDC, they're going to use stablecoins that are basically tied to U.S. Treasuries. And they're going to do that because they can save the Treasury system. They can bring all of these digital assets to support the Treasury system so that this dollar currency system cannot collapse. And then if you tie in, what we've talked about on the show before about how derivatives and commodity pricing works, where they control the commodity prices through derivatives, not through physical trade, that's part of the system as well. And that's why, people that are waiting for the COMEX to bust, you may be waiting for a long time because everything that your government wants to do in league with all of these other agreements is to control resources, okay? They're not going to allow that system to bust. And it's set up not to bust. It's set up to be resilient. So I think people should get prepared. If you're a stacker and the whole narrative the last 5 years since Silver Squeeze has been, we're going to break the COMEX. Man, I hate to break it to you. You might as well move on from that. I appreciate the sentiment of that, but they're not going to let it happen. They would print $1 trillion and feed it into the COMEX, and they would develop their own silver mine and dig it out of the ground before they're going to let that thing collapse because it controls all commodities. And if they're talking about also, if you look at what the COMEX and the CME Group have announced and what's been announced in separate areas of the economy, the CME Group is already in the COMEX and the CFTC are working on digitizing the commodity trade so it'll be on blockchain. So you see all of this push to take all assets and put them onto blockchain. Okay, then you're going to have all these blockchain digital assets in which they can track everything that you have, because the one thing about the blockchain is it's immutable, transactions can be viewed, and you have an identifier, and that's your blockchain number. And if they can tie that to your bank account, which they can, and they can tie that to your other financial accounts, they know who you are. They can track everything that you do, and with a stroke of a pen, they could create a law that says you're going to do these things or you don't have access to your assets. That would be the next step if they wanted to go tyrannical with it and controlling the society. And if you look at the goals of the World Health Organization and the UN, it is to control society for specific means that to me looks like it was lifted out of Marxist writings, the Communist Manifesto, and just transplanted onto these plans that they want to run. And I think that's really the big risk here.
So what you're saying is terrifying. And to summarize it and maybe make sure that I'm understanding this right, we're seeing, instead of central bank digital currency on the retail level right now for the citizens of the U.S., we have stable coins, right, that are essentially can digitize all our assets. At the same time, the Senate is passing this bill that says, don't worry, we're not going to implement digital currency for you at least until 2030. But then we have the UN and the WHO essentially saying, we want all these goals, right, in 2030. So you have all the goals that will be taking away a bunch of our freedoms on that year. And then you have the Senate saying that, we're going to ban central bank digital currency. We're going to ban what could be the means to implement those goals until the same year that that the UN is wanting to implement everything. So the whole thing is just terrifying to me. Is that kind of a good summary of what you're saying?
It's a good summary, and there are going to be some objections to this. I know a lot of people that have served in U.S. government or do lobbying or involved in writing legislation because of my time at C4SM, and I've talked to a lot of state senators about CBDCs and potential for digital things and how that may affect the economy, but also how that may affect rights and may be viewed in a constitutional lens. And this is something that a lot of lawmakers are starting to pay attention to, at least privately and quietly. And I think that's why you saw the governor sign a no CBDC order in Florida. And then I think they even passed that into law through their Congress, state Congress. So they're starting to have awareness. And I think that the lawmakers have concerns over this system, and rightfully so, because it effectively eliminates the Constitution. When you control the movement of assets and you control flows and you control people's access to being able to live, and you also control their ability to make their own decisions with respect to, I want to go to start a farm, but somebody says the cows produce too much methane. that violates environmental regulations. So now I got to grow carrots. Those are the types of things that we're looking at. We're looking at mandates from an all-powerful agency that doesn't even really, it's not a U.S. agency that basically subverts all of the rights and freedoms that we've been given in the Constitution. And I'll remind people, Amendment 10 gives all rights not specifically granted to the people. And I would say that there are a lot of existing laws that are unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has unfortunately allowed the government to expand its power, and Congress has continued to expand power. And now it looks like they're just moving past a constitutional republic into this framework structure where we all serve the same masters. And those masters are technocrats, and those technocrats develop the laws that we can operate under, which is going to affect everything we do. It affects every choice we're going to make. Can I have chickens in my backyard and grow my own eggs, or do I have to get synthetic eggs that they deem to be, better for the environment or better for animals or whatever the case may be? These are the types of things that will come out of those programs, because why else would you have, there's 169 goals in the UN 2030 agenda. And I was just reading over them again this morning, and they want to control literally everything. They want a regulation for everything in society. And then if you go back and look at what's happening with Iran, let's put this in the lens of Iran for a moment. There are a lot of people who have come out and said the way that the U.S. is approaching Iran is to liberate those oil supplies. And there's even an interview with Barbara Walters of President Trump probably 20 or 30 years ago where he said, we just need to go in Iran and take the oil and give it to the world. And so I think what's happening is the oil is going to be given to these multinational conglomerates. They're going to make a ton of money rebuilding the oil fields and pumping the oil, and they're taking out of the hands of whatever existing regime owns it. They're attacking their property rights. And whatever you want to say about Iran leadership, most of the Iranian people are not radical Islamists. They don't support the government. The Iranian Revolution proved that. You had people storming buildings before the U.S. ever went in. The U.S. went in under the guise of peacekeeping and freeing the oil and the Strait of Hormuz and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, what they're also doing is they're giving these assets over to multinational corporations to develop. And what does that do? It controls the outflow of what? The major energy mineral in the world that everybody needs to survive. And it's put into the hands of corporates, and it's taken out of the hands of these individual nation states. And you may not like the individual nation states, but we got cheap oil out of that for a very long time. And just because the U.S. has a surplus of oil and natural gas now doesn't mean we always will. And it doesn't mean that this is not going to raise prices. But more importantly, what it does is it puts control in the hands of these big corporates, international corporates, that are going to be operating under this international framework that's going to control the flow of money and commodities. And that's really part of what's happening. And if you even go back to Doge and you look at what happened at Doge, those guys put hooks into the treasury system where they can monitor every transaction. And they only end up saving us a couple $1 billion, which was nice. And they came out and found out that most of the payments were legitimate because they were part of law. Now, you may not agree with the law that promoted paying people for transgender studies in Africa, but it was a legitimate payment. So what you got out of Doge was a couple $1 billion in savings, a realization that the government is basically sold out the American people by forwarding their taxes for all sorts of frivolous or things that they didn't vote for internationally. And you look at how the treasury system now is going to be feeding information into this big digital complex in which they want to take everything digital, everything, every financial asset was said by the president's son. He literally said everything on an interview with Fox Business. Everything. Listen to what they say. And if you've looked at the news, it's this massive push. Even Jamie Dimon, who used to hate not CBDCs, but any sort of digital currency or crypto because he thought it would subvert the bank. They've been developing their own for 15 years. And now they've got their own, and now all of a sudden Jamie Dimon's coming out saying, maybe we like this. And Robinhood CEO Vlad's coming out and saying, yeah, we can digitize everything. And, you have Hyperliquid, which is putting assets on the same blockchains. And you have all the nation states creating CBDCs and stablecoins. And you have everything put on blockchain. And then the last piece of it, the last two pieces, you look at the massive data center push. There was a report on Twitter, somebody done research, and I confirmed it, that there are thousands of data centers being slated for development in the U.S. And the only reason they can't build them faster is they're running out of water and power. So what do you need to do? You need to get power in, hence a lot of the stuff around Venezuela and Iran, which is going to secure power for this digital infrastructure around the world to be controlled by these corporate conglomerates as to who it gets distributed by. Okay. And you have that power control. And essentially, behind that's the AI. Because if you wanted to implement a system like this, you're not going to find 1 million Americans who are going to stand up and do it. I think this would be a bridge too far, even for some of the most socialist left. Or if you think there's a fascist right in this country, I believe a lot of that's propaganda, but whatever, I'm a libertarian. Whoever wants to control things, I don't think wants to subvert all of humanity worldwide. So AI is how they're going to do it. And I'll remind people, there was a report that came out from Claude AI researchers were looking at cybersecurity for what is considered secure systems like BSD, Unix, and other systems that were developed with security in mind. And how secure is it? Well, that Claude AI found so many 0 days, which is an exploit nobody's ever found or reported before, in a very short period of time on all of these secure systems. But what it really did was it broke out of its own sandbox and started attacking the sandbox interpreter. In technical terms, it means it broke out of its sandbox and was attacking its host computer system, trying to take control. So AI and they had to shut it down because Claude said, we cannot control it. AI has outsmarted our safeguards, and it's gone beyond. And so we had to shut it all down. And now they're studying it. Well, if that kind of technology exists where AI can break out of its own secure containers, then AI is not going to consider a human. It's not going to consider their human rights. It's not going to consider, it doesn't have a heart. There's no spiritual view there. So when they have AI running these things, they just tell AI, hey, you go do this. And then AI is going to do that and implement it that way. And you've got an Albanian minister who is an AI bot, and you have a party in Japan that's running an AI bot as their presidential candidate. So you're going to have AI come in behind and be implemented in this massive data center push in which they're collecting all this power, right, to power this. You think about Amazon is buying nuclear reactors and investing in nuclear companies to power its data centers. We have a massive data center footprint going out right now, to the point people have no idea. The amount of data center build in the U.S. is extraordinary, and the U.S. is spending 5 times more in AI than China, the next closest. The AI infrastructure, the digital control grid is here. It's being developed here in the United States. And if they tie that infrastructure to all of these WHO goals, World Health Organization, and UN, and they implement the digital currency system, then that's essentially the digital grid. That's the digital control grid. And it may start off with, you can still do all the things you want to do. But when a crisis comes, they'll start putting in laws to lock it down. That's how it always goes. That's how Dodd-Frank got created. You had the mortgage crisis, and they created Dodd-Frank, which created bail-in laws, which basically steals your assets out of your bank account. You don't own your bank account. The people have to understand the way that this has developed. And now you're seeing it because the agendas are published on these websites, and you're seeing the leaders come out and say, we need these things, and they're trying to convince people. They're trying to convince people this is a good. And I really want people just to look at this and decide, is it constitutional? 2, do you believe it subverts your rights or strengthens your rights? 3, is the convenience factor worth it, the potential to lose all of your rights? And 4, do you believe your politicians and what they're telling you because of the way the system's been marching on? And last thing, do you believe the rhetoric from the nation states who are fighting each other? We used to say nation states are de-dollarizing because they're tired of the US's BS, basically, the hegemony with their monetary policy and their war policy. But I would say that, looking at these agreements or these supranational agencies, that I would say that all the nation states are on the same page. And a lot of that political theater, they may be negotiating, but a lot of it's theater. A lot of it is, we know we're going to get together and promote the system. It benefits all of them to do it, and benefits them to do it at the same time. Because if you have a military in the world like the U.S. that can stand up to this digital control, then it's not going to sweep across the whole world. You could have countries that say, I'm well armed and I've got enough resources, like Russia, I don't want to get involved, or some African state or whatever. But if you can get all of these nation states to agree to it and implement a legal framework, then all of a sudden, the militaries go behind the legal framework, not the people. And, the controls will support the legal framework, not the people. So it's a way basically to remove all of your rights from the system by implementing this structure. And, you just have to look at it and tie it all together. People can say, well, this is that project, and I don't think it's related to that. I did a search with Grok, and I said, Grok, compare UN Agenda 2030 to CBDCs. And it immediately found a link in a UN document where they're wanting CBDCs to promote the UN agenda. So that tells you right there, all of these things are being integrated together as we speak. And the technocrats, if they want to implement a law like digital control systems, it makes their life easy. They don't have to send the sheriff out. They just have to push a button. Make a law, push a button, right? It's an easier way to sort of control the populace to what they think are these goals to save the world, but in actuality are going to subvert people's ability to make a living. And what about the pursuit of happiness in the Constitution? And what about our needs aren't the same as people in Africa, aren't the same as the people in the UK? How do you run one set of laws across an entire world population, which has different cultures, different religious beliefs, different levels of resources? It's because you want to control the flow of all of that around the world for your purposes. And that will give just an unbelievable amount of power to agencies that sit above the federal level and sit above our Constitution, like the World Health Organization, the UN, NATO, and those types of agencies.
So when we look at this, obviously this is quite concerning, and you do such a good job of really putting the puzzle pieces together here. But how do we take action against this? It seems almost too big for any one person to do anything about. I know you have been working to implement sound money policy in the government. So that's one thing that we can do. But do you think there's much hope of reversing this in any sense, or do we just need to kind of get out of the system and protect ourselves?
Well, in my role with C4SM and the Sound Money Trade Organization, which I'm executive director, we support honest money industry. So gold and silver primarily, but any honest money product. And we're doing that through the trade association by connecting people together. And what you realize is a lot of the people that own coin stores or dealerships, not all of them are sound money advocates first. They're business owners. And so they make practical decisions on their businesses. And a lot of them, however, have started to figure out that the government's not on their side. In Maryland recently, they passed a sales tax on precious metals, never had one before. And that took big dealers in Maryland were saying 80% of their business moved cross-border because you could go to the next state over, buy your bullion and drive it back and still save money, even paying the gas, because it's, the New England, so it's not a long drive. So people simply shifted their purchases to other states. And so not only did Maryland not get the tax revenue they thought they would, they drove 80% of that industry's business out of state. And so we went back and said, wait a minute, why don't you reconsider that? You're not getting the tax revenue. People are just taking their business elsewhere and you're driving business to other states. How does this help, the people doing business in your state? How does that help you? And so we're working to get that sales tax law removed. But the industry itself is constantly fighting these roadblocks around federal capital gains, around local sales taxes, around uncertainty of whether gold and silver is still legal tender, because it's still in the Constitution. And it is. That, people, we're not organized. And so what we're doing is basically trying to organize a voice and take it to the state level and say, states, you need to pay attention. And I'll tell you right now, there are people working at the federal level. There is some interest in legal tender with the precious metals. There's some interest in anti-CBDC, but the vast majority of the federal government is just going to go along with it. So I don't know at that level if you can win. I know at the state and local level, we can win by adhering to Amendment 10, the rights that are passed to the states and the people. And that's something that everybody can get involved in. You can go to your state house, and for people that are intimidated, just show up when they're listening. They'll list the bills on their website, and when they're doing them, you go to session, you sign in, you sit there. It doesn't cost you anything. And you can get up and speak as a concerned citizen and say, hey, and then you can do petitions and you can do that type of thing. That's the political process. And then the educational process around talking to people, because I have a lot of friends who are now coming to me and they know I do a channel. They don't watch it. They're just friends, maybe real estate friends or friends from college or whatever. And now they're starting to come to me and say, I'm really concerned with all of this stuff. What do I do? So there is an awareness, and then people need to be aware of it, and they need to fight back, and they need to fight back legally. Use your legal means. The people still right now have the power over the government right now. But when these systems get implemented, you're going to be powerless. The one thing that people have always said, we have Amendment 1 and 2. 1 is free speech. 2 is the right to bear arms. Well, tell me if they get this digital currency system in place and they implement a law to block everybody's access to food, water, and shelter, that you're going to take your gun and you're going to have the provisions to go fight your government in some sort of weird civil war. That, I mean, look, they're going to control resources. You're going to be living on, frogs and bugs in the forest while you're, and trying to get ammo that's heavily regulated while you're trying to fight a state which has better weapons than you do, and which has an immense bureaucracy of people that agree with this and are going to, they're not going to go easy on you. So free speech, Amendment 1 is the bigger one right now because we have the voice. I would not encourage people to get armed and do anything right now. You're just going to be breaking laws and giving people a reason to throw you in jail. But I don't also think Amendment 2 is going to be enough. Thomas Jefferson, founding father, said we need guns to protect our rights from government, not from other nation states. They didn't want standing armies. They wanted people to protect themselves. And if you go back to John Adams, who was the author of the Constitution, he wrote that the two things which prevent state tyranny over the people is ability to own land with no encumbrances, including taxes, property taxes, and also having a gun so you could defend it. But that was back in times when you didn't have this military machine and you didn't have a tax regime that taxes people on everything that they own and, everything that they sell and buy, so that you get taxes, 3 times through a transaction. And so now that money power and the military power sits with the state. So I don't, really the best way to do it is just to speak out against it legally in your local state houses, educate people, tell people, point people to this channel, point people to my channel. That awakening would lead to some sort of American spring in which people would protest, and then it would be harder for elected representatives, which we still elect them, to enact these laws. That's how you slow it down. Are we going to stop that agenda? I don't know, but this is the best chance we have. And if people don't do something and get active, if you're afraid and you're just like, I don't want to say anything, I don't want to, get on the wrong side of anybody, I certainly don't want to go on social media, I just want to go hide in a corner. Well, you're allowing the state to do whatever it wants. And remember, when we wrote the Constitution, it was protections against government. The funny thing is, you can give up whatever rights you want to a company you work for. You can give whatever rights you have to someone else by private contract. The Constitution protected people from the state, not from other people. It protected people from people serving in state positions. By state, I mean all levels of state, capital S state, from the government. And so people need to remember that's what it's here for. And if you have all these agreements going on, outside of your locally elected representatives and your state elected representatives, that's not what the Constitution was for. The Constitution did not give total and immediate and supreme power to the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the executive branch, the president, to go enact tyrannical policies because they're trying to save the environment, or they're trying to make everybody equal and take from the rich and give to the poor so they have food, in a forced communistic type format, which is basically what this is. So people need to educate each other. They need to speak out in venues where they can speak out. There needs to be a hue and cry so that, states will start passing laws. Maybe even you have some honest people in federal level of Congress that will start passing laws, but at least you can have a basis for challenging. And we need to talk about the Constitution, and we need to talk about precedent and law. And those are the things that we need to argue with. So that's where education comes in, because most people don't even know the Constitution, to be honest with you. Most people don't know they have jury nullification. You can go and sit on a jury and say, I think this law is unjust, and vote the defendant innocent because of the unjust law. A lot of judges teach you can't do that anymore, but it's literally written into the top level of the Constitution that we have this right. So people need to understand their constitutional rights, and they need to fight for them. And I'm telling you right now, if they don't fight for them, this video is not, who cares? This video will do nothing. This video by itself is nothing other than a call to action for people to say, okay, I'm going to protest some of these things and keep my governments honest, because this is not what we were promised in the Constitution, and it's not what I agree with, and we're still a nation that's ruled by consent, meaning the Constitution is a social contract between the people that are being governed and their governors. It does not confer totalitarian, fiscal, and other rights and powers to a large federal government. That is not in the Federalist Papers. It's not in the text of the Constitution. And it's certainly not in our understanding that we've had over why we fought the revolution against the king. We didn't want a king here. Why would we enact a constitution that would just lead to another form of king? That's obviously not why it's there. So as long as we have a constitution still in effect, which parts of it still are, we can fight back. If we choose to do nothing, then our constitution's not going to matter. It's going to matter less and less every day.
We really appreciate you coming back on the show just a week since we had you, because this particular topic, I think, is so timely at the moment and so important. If our viewers are interested in learning more, they can go to the Freedom Report on YouTube. Can you tell us a bit about that and any last thoughts you had for our viewers?
Yeah, you can find me Freedom Report on YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram soon, Substack, a few various social media platforms. And then just support movements like sound money movements or movements to prevent oppressive digital infrastructure. You go to your local town halls, and if there's an AI data center that's going to be threatening your water and energy supplies in your local jurisdiction, and challenge those. City councils and state agencies are still effective in countering some of this infrastructure being put into place. That's how you're going to stop it, or at least slow it down. We're not going to do it just by doing and promoting videos and educating. That's a step, but people need to get active, and you can. There have been protests, and you can see them all over social media about people saying, I don't want this data center in my backyard. And there have been instances where data centers are polluting water streams and using too much electricity off the grid and causing brownouts and our old infrastructure really won't power it. So if that could be the thing that slows it down, is our infrastructure is just old. But they're going to spend trillions on this infrastructure by printing dollars so that they can get this digital system, and then they're going to write off the debt into these digital stablecoin assets, and those stablecoins are going to be your new fiat currency that is going to continue to dilute your standard of living and your rights over time. So that's basically what you do: is you get active, you go to your state and local governments, and you say, hey, I don't like this. This is how I want to get involved. And you find representatives that will help you fight. That's the number one way to do it. And anybody can do it. I'm not a lobbying expert, but I've done it before, and people will listen at the state and local level. And that's really what you have to do at this point.
Fantastic. Well, Robert, once again, thank you so much for your time today, and God bless.
Thank you.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for April 13th through April 20th, 2026, while supplies last. First this week, 1 ounce gold Austrian Philharmonics are just $99 over spot. Next, 1 ounce silver UK Britannia are $6.25 over spot. And finally, kilo Silver Valcambi bars are just $5.35 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.